Okay, this video is dedicated to the timeline widget. The timeline widget is one of the more complex widgets, not overwhelmingly so, but it's got a lot of idiosyncrasies to it. First off, there are two types of timelines, a grid timeline and a case timeline. We'll explore both of them. We're going to talk about using the timelines. We're going to talk about how the timelines relate to other widgets because um, with a few exceptions, this is probably one of the best widgets for, if you will, controlling the data set and thereby affecting the other widgets. And then finally, the timeline playback, which is really very much connected to that controlling the other widgets conversation, but it's sort of its own cool thing, so I wanted to break it out. So let's go into the tool and explore it. So I am logged into the Mantooth case. You can see the date range of this case is from January 95 all the way to 2007. Let's open up the timeline widget here. Let's start out on the case timeline. Let's hope this thing goes away here. There we go. Oh, shoot, I opened up another one. Okay, perfect. All right, so we're starting out on the case timeline. You can see that these dates nearly exactly match these dates. They do not exactly match it because we here are in an annual time frame because the data is spanning so much data that we've had to group the data, and as such, we've had to extend out the top range to some degree. But nonetheless, they more or less match. And you can see this grid, this is the case timeline, spans the entire case, which is why you have some really high stacks of data here, 61,000 data points, 42,000 data points, whereas all the way to the extreme you can hardly see it, but there's one data point there in 1995. That's why it stretches way to the left, and there are 483 over there. But my main point here is this is clearly a representation of all the data in the case. We can contrast that with the grid timeline, which let's refresh this a little bit, pull it in here a little bit. This is a much smaller set of data. You can see it only spans from 2007 through 2017. And if you counted all the squares here, you'd find there were 100 of them. And that 100 precisely matches the number of items in the grid. Now let's drill down on some of the features of this grid timeline because, again, it can get confusing, frankly. The most important and most confusing parts of this timeline are this view size and cluster by group category. View size is the dominant one. It generally drives the cluster by. And what I mean by that is if your view size is smaller than the total amount of data in your data set, it will begin to cluster your data, first going with by exact time, then day, then week, then month, finally until giving up at month, trying to get the number of blocks, if you will, down to a small enough number so it can display them all based on whatever criteria you've given it. In this case, we're only graphing 100 items, so it was able to display them all. But if we were to ratchet this down to 20, it would group our data by week. Now you say, well, hold on, Tim. It seems to have skipped over day, exact time, and day. Well, it didn't skip over them. It tried them. But after trying them, it found out the number it would have to graph still exceeds the 20. So it went to the next one, and so on and so forth, this time stopping at week. Your options for view size are 20, 50, 100, and all. Don't choose all. I debated, frankly, capping it at 100 and not even providing the all option. But, listen, if your data set exceeds 100 by a little, 120, whatever, go ahead, you can use all. But the speed at which this widget works is a direct function of how many of these blocks are in view. And at 100, it still performs well, but it almost, you can start to see sluggishness starting to appear. I used to have a 500 number here, and at 500, you definitely felt pain, so I removed that. So I would recommend you keep it relatively small. So let's explore what it does in these groupings. It grabs the data by week, if you will, and throws them into these groupings, but you don't have to just leave it at the groupings. You can click on these, and it will show you what is in that group. And it will center on that item, and you can always actually come up here and navigate the grid using these zoom out, zoom in. This will fit all, so I can remove that sort of zooming effect it just had and resize back to all if I want. But you can navigate throughout the data by just clicking on these things, and it will show you that data in the grid. Like with the other widgets, when I interacted with the grid-based widget, it put the lock on, the database lock on, because it knows you're interacting with data that's already in the grid, and it does not want to bother to go fetch more data. So it throws up the grid lock. You navigate using date. Let's say we want to zoom up to, let's say, 2009, January 2009. And notice it doesn't have January 2009 here. Frankly, it's zoomed down to a very specific time. And that is because with our grouping, when we chose 2009, all the data points except for one were excluded. So it went and zoomed in on that one data point. That one data point, because we're grouping by week, actually happens to contain 35 data points. So you can see the grid here is reflective of that. So if I wanted to change now the graphing, if you will, and do the 100, and I changed the week clustering. It'll expand those nodes out, and we get a better sense for the date range we're dealing with here. And we can go ahead and expand back out to the entire data set. Oh, excuse me, interesting. I tried to expand the entire data set, but I've filtered it already. If I want to go back to the entire data set, I have to change my date range here, or I can always just click here, and it will expand me back out. So that is the a grid or a grid-based timeline. There are two other actually things to note really quickly. The label, you can change what you're labeling. Right now we're just doing the default label, which is object ID, but you can change it to object name if you want. For this data set, it's not a particularly good selection because these are all ridiculous object names, but if you have more normal data, it would work fine. You can also group by stuff, and I'll show you what that is. Group by file category, and it will arrange your timeline based on these groups. These are the text files, these are the NT registry files, and so on and so forth. When I put that stuff in, I thought it was super cool. Now that I've played with it more, I'm not sure how much application it really has, but it's there nonetheless. All right, let's go now to the case timeline. We will jump back to the grid timeline here in a second, but let's explore some of the features of the case timeline. Again, graphing the entire case. So let's close this because we don't really need to see the grid anymore. And you can see, actually, you can hardly see some, but I just noticed for a second there are some other data points here. And you can zoom into those if you want, but based on the scale of the sort of 60,000 items, they become almost invisible. But you can navigate this grid by using Shift and the mouse, and you can zoom in. And it will resize things accordingly. And you can zoom in here. Let's zoom into here. Now, the cool thing about this is once you have the range that you like, you can go ahead and click on this. And it will expand that data point. That data point, as you I don't know if you could tell before, but we were still dealing with annualized data points. But we focused in enough such that maybe we didn't want annualized data points anymore and we could click on it. Now it looks like we're dealing with near monthly. This might be, in fact, daily data points. Let's click and see if it expands this out even more. Yep, it expanded it out even more. And now we're clearly dealing with daily data points. We probably can't expand out anymore. But you can constantly be clicking and expanding down. Ultimately, the deepest it can go is to the by date. If you have a range you're happy with, excuse me, I meant by day. If you have a range you're happy with here, you can go ahead and apply that. Now that will affect the entire data set. You have, whether you know it or not, just filtered in. You've effectively applied a facet filter, and you filter the entire data set down to this amount. Now, interestingly enough, I've just gotten caught by something I've told you guys many times not to get caught by. I was playing around with the timeline grid, which is a grid-based widget. When I did that, it applied the database lock. I forgot to unlock it when I moved to the case timeline. So I'm going to have to reapply that if I wanted to actually go get the data and rebuild all the widgets. I can, of course, expand back to everything and apply that again, and I've effectively cleared the widget at that point. I could have equally just clicked here to clear the widget and back to an unfiltered state. You can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can print a PDF. Let me show you the last cool feature of Timeline, and that is in the grid. These things are really annoying. I don't know why they're not going away. In the grid-based timeline, you have these play buttons. And you can interact with all other widgets via the play button. I'm just going to choose to interact with the grid at the moment. It's the least exciting of them, but you'll get a sense for how it works. And you've seen these play buttons on other widgets, particularly the map widget and the social analyzer. And it's just going to slowly scroll through all these documents, and you can speed it up and go a little bit faster if you want, and you can go super fast if you want. It's just going to fly through the data points. So, and then you can pause and go back to going relatively slow through them, and there you go. And then you can start again if you want. And if you play the timeline widget, if you use these buttons, it will affect more than just this. It would also affect the map. It will affect the social analyzer. It will affect a whole bunch of widgets. So that's the timeline widget. Hopefully that was helpful and you got some good value out of it. Thank you very much.